My name is Tim Carter. This lesson is for the students in KOINE University. It's an extension of IamKOINE.org, the Apologetic and Outreach Ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas. This topic is called the gap theory. I recently did a video about people asking the question, are you Protestant, Catholic, are you Arminian or Calvinist? Now there's who knows how many more options. Are you open theism, closed theism, pre-trib rapture, post-trib rapture? Are you young earth or old earth? Well, when I talk about the gap theory, it's really something that's intriguing to me because in the language courses, which is a language-based university, showing the university that's in the scriptures when we all adhere to the grammar, syntax, etymology, root meanings of nouns, and then acknowledge the emphasis of kind of action. And then we have that in both Old Testament, Biblical Hebrew has different stems, two states, to indicate the relationship of the subject to the action. So causal action, causal active, causal passive, there's two of those stems. So those things are very specific in the Bible, answering a lot of things that wouldn't otherwise be questioned today. But the gap theory, before I answer, my language teacher, specifically Dr. Mark Thornton, would say context. He wouldn't just say, are you for gap or against gap, which would mean you're treating someone like a mouse in a maze, and you're asking the mouse to be prepared to give the right answer, or as you provide a stimulus, which is the question, you get a response, and then you provide reinforcing consequences. I don't know what those would be in America, and it's come to my attention that people have conveyed consequences to me. I wouldn't get it. As an educated person who comes from professional backgrounds, plural, and then is in the faith once delivered that is professional, like some people say they're confessional, meaning that they uphold and support confessions. We're professional, meaning we hold fast to our profession of faith. So I wouldn't know to expect much more from people who would impose social penalties or whatever the social Darwinian construct is, of which they themselves will be completely unaware. Now, they practice it, but reinforcing consequences, I've never incurred those, not since I've come out of psychological-based religious orders, which are all built on a performance-based gospel. It's performance-driven. There's no life there. There's no purpose there. It's just performance-driven. So they're incognizant of it. They treat people like mice because they are mice. But my language teacher, particularly Dr. Mark Thornton, Missionary Baptist Seminary, a young man, very scholastic, he would have not started there. He, as a humane person, would have said, when we talk about the gap theory itself, we just have a couple things we have to do first. You'll see all the difficulties, as we learned in our language class in a book about syntax. We learned that the embarrassing difficulty, or difficulties, plural, that are often associated with fallible constructs and, let's say, differences of views and opinions are removed when you just approach it simply as it can be done with the language. I say simply, I should say rather precisely. So the first thing I was taught, especially in my language classes, and the hermeneutics class, Brother John Penn taught for almost 40 years, but number one would be context. Well, if you're in Genesis 1:2, that is, if you start here at G1:2 and ask then about gap theory, you fall immediately for an absence of context. But then if someone says context, because if you start in verse 2, even Hebrew teachers will tell you it's difficult to convince someone of come to be as opposed to was, or was as opposed to come to be. So frustrating that can become that you might find even Hebrew scholars saying, you just can't prove it from the Hebrew. Well, that's because something's missing. And what's missing would be Genesis 1:1. So now we look for the error of omission. There we go. And then before you get into that false dichotomy of young or old earth, and you jump into a maze with other mice who don't even realize they've been conditioned by stimuli, and then their responses have had reinforcing consequences to assure that they always choose B or always choose A, and then to the point where they're not even any longer cognizant that they're humans. They just react to avoid negative consequences, that is negative reinforcing consequences, or they react to receive positive reinforcing, social currency, money, status, whatever all that is. We have come out of Egyptianity, we know what you're talking about from a viewpoint of an educated person. We just don't know it experientially. That is, we don't practice social Darwinism and then call that Christianity. We don't stumble around and pretend we don't know what the gospel is, or that we don't know how to lead someone to Christ. We don't wander around saying young or old as if those two options are all we could possibly know. So the context here, what's left out is G1:1. So go back to Genesis 1:1, and then the language settles it for everyone. There's really nothing else to talk about, because you go to John 1, verse 1, and in English it says, "In the beginning was the Word." Well, Genesis 1:1, which we'll say that's our context. And by the time you get to verse 2, all you have is Genesis 1:1. So here's all we have, but it's all we need. So in John 1:1, "In the beginning was the Word," you can see then in English, you can read your King James Bible, and unfortunately I'm quoting the Oxford edition. I don't have a Cambridge edition with me to quote that. But so it says, "In the beginning was the Word." So we know in Genesis 1:1, "In beginning," it says in English, "in the beginning," so we know the Word's already being there. And then if you want to support that and demonstrate it rather easily from the Koine Greek New Testament, but you already have it in the English, so if the Word was already being there, and it's an imperfect tense, you'll learn that when you take language at the Missionary Baptist Seminary. And yes, you'll decline your nouns, conjugate your verbs, and communicate the kind of action of the imperfect tense, which, as Dr. Thornton would teach you, is a past ongoing action sometime in the past, a continuous action in the past. So it's self-evident in John 1:1 then that the Word was already being in beginning. So the Word's already being in beginning. So in beginning, where the Word is already being, or from English, in the beginning, where in the beginning the Word already was, then created the heavens, or heaven singular in English, and the earth singular in the Old Testament, Genesis 1:1. So we now have all we need to know. There's no time there, and it's instant and spoken creation, where there's other text in the Bible that would then echo that, like a catechismic, according to an echo. You have other verses that sound the same, that is, they message and speak the same thing. So really the gap theory is no longer even possible with context. That is, it's no longer possible to debate whether or not something came to be to cause the earth to be without form and empty. And then you don't have to get into that exasperating futility of starting at verse 2. So yes, Dr. Mark Thornton was absolutely correct, and yes, the Missionary Baptist Seminary is absolutely correct to teach context first. And yes, you can go all the way back to publications that the Missionary Baptist Seminary would provide and publish, literally, Credenda 1, Credenda 2, as late as 1984. But now to demonstrate it irrefutably, which did not occur in Credenda 2, as well as J.C. James had written, it was excellent work, and as scholastic as that was, those of us who are students who come and learn what we knew then and then build and go forward, especially Dr. Dillard, W.A. Dillard, Hebrew scholar, he'll tell you quickly, because of the knowledge of the Bible, that Genesis 1:1 is instant and spoken creation. That is, and because the Word was there in beginning was the Word. Even in English, a person using hermeneutics and respecting the text of the King James that they're using, for example, only as an example, because that's the last Bible where there was persecution for those who were involved. Our history stops on that Bible where we were persecuted by even the king of that state religion, Church of England, which is Episcopalian. So long story short is, if you establish in Genesis 1:1 what John 1:1 teaches irrefutably, so the Word was already being there, was already there, you could say, in beginning was the Word, in beginning God created. So that way you're done here. Since that's established, there's nothing here to question, just here to learn. So you can now move on and stop trying to banter with people who say was means was, or it's become or come to be. Then you don't have a lot of burden on you about why did the English translators say without form and void. Well, because it was known that something had to occur to take us from an instant and spoken creation to a condition that do not reflect that. And there's several other texts, but you don't have to go anywhere. Just start at Genesis 1:1. You get that correct. Make sure you respect verse 2, that is Genesis 1:1, as a context. It's the only contextual element we thus far have. Then we have the New Testament revelation that John had given, echoing all the way back, saying the Word was already being there. So now, this really isn't a debatable item any longer. This is not. Now, what people try to say about it, especially when you consider the divine ratio, which that's similar to the preciseness of arithmetic in the Bible. Even in the book of Daniel, we have until the very day the Messiah was cut off. I have a book written by a Jewish rabbi where they omit after chapter 5 of Daniel, intentionally omitting any commentary in the book by this particular rabbi, because in the book of Daniel, the arithmetic, their book teaches specifically, but as anyone who cares to get out a pencil and piece of paper can tell you, 12,500 years times 360 lunar days equals 4.5 million days times 1,000 years gives you the 4.5 billion that people are so alarmed about. And it's not even mathematics, it's arithmetic, similar to the calculations in Daniel. It's really just arithmetic. Arithmetic is just a matter of multiplying and adding, subtracting, division, but that's not really advanced mathematics. So when you see there is a relationship with how old the earth had to be, as one person said, but it's 6,000. Well, he said as 1,000 years, as 1,000 years. Peter said it. And then you have it in Psalm 90 as 1,000 years. And in arithmetic, mathematics, you'd say approximately 1,000 years. And Jesus said there's 12 hours in a day. So this time here is actually 12 hours per day. That would be 6,250, which is approximately 6,000. So yes, in just a few, not even a paragraph of exposition, not more than 2 verses, Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1, and then parallelism, which is to take Psalm 90 verse 4 and then what Peter said in 2 Peter 3 verse 8. You say, well, that looks simple. Well, it never was difficult. It was difficult because of what I was also taught in hermeneutics and in the language classes and in my systematic theology class. So Dr. John Owen cautioned us to be careful if we get off track early. So Genesis 1:1 would be the earliest place to be off track. And then Brother Penn emphasized context. And then Dr. Thornton taught us how to use the root meanings, the kinds of action to emphasize that and let that speak. And he was correct when he told me specifically and personally in class, all the students, that we can derive our theology from the languages. So that's what this is, language-based apologetics. But we take pre-understanding is where I was going. Is when we carry pre-understanding into the Bible, that can be complicated. And for those who don't use the languages, it's always complicated. It's always complex, abstract. and we still have to battle with cultural realities of a Western Occidental culture, imposing our Western Occidental culture onto an Eastern Oriental text. So with that in mind, that's enough, but the gap theory is no longer, it never was out there in limbo, up for grabs, where people are you for it or against it. It's really settled with context verse 1, and it's absolutely demonstrated that the earth did not have to come into existence until several thousand years ago, approximately 6,000, according to 12-hour days. As Jesus said, there's 12 hours in the day, but multiplying that by 24 hours doubles the time to 12,500, which gives us the 4.5 billion, which again, okay, I'm just as impressed and not surprised by that I was prompted to go and find as a research assistant, which it was easy to find once I was sent in the right direction. So I am grateful for Dr. Penn, as he's known as Dr. Penn, our beloved hermeneutics teacher, when he sent me that direction to do the research. But the research was not as difficult as seeing the direction to go. So, and the language that I learned in graduate school under Dr. Mark Thornton was very good in helping me 10 years after I'd graduated go back and reinforce the learning and see just how accurate and precise your theology can be. So there's no contradiction in the Bible, there's no flummoxes that are often touted out there. So yes, this is the gap theory in sum and very simply stated, and it's irrefutable, and it's just a matter of what's fallible is how many things people try to place in that gap. So, but you have a blessed day and enjoy this lesson from KOINE U University.